The small town had been talking about this wedding for weeks. It was not because the couple was famous or wealthy, but because everyone believed it would be a perfect story of love and patience. The bride had grown up there, known for her calm nature and quiet smile. The groom had moved into the town years ago and slowly earned respect through hard work and kindness. People believed their marriage was meant to be. On the morning of the wedding, the church stood peaceful under the soft daylight. The old building had seen many ceremonies before, but this one felt special to those who arrived early. The wooden doors were open, letting warm air and gentle light fill the hall. Flowers were placed carefully along the aisles, simple but elegant. Nothing felt rushed or careless. Everything looked prepared just as a wedding should be. Guests arrived one by one, greeting each other with excitement. Some had traveled from nearby towns, while others had lived here all their lives. Laughter echoed softly as people found their seats. Elderly couples whispered memories of their own weddings. Children fidgeted in their chairs, bored but curious. Everyone expected joy. No one expected anything else. The preacher arrived quietly and stood near the altar, checking his book and taking slow breaths. He had led many weddings before. To him, every ceremony was important, but this one felt heavier in a way he could not explain. He brushed the feeling aside, telling himself it was just another busy day. Still, something about the silence before the ceremony made him pause longer than usual. Behind the church doors, the bride sat in a small room, dressed in white. Her gown was simple, not overly decorated, but it suited her well. The veil rested gently on her shoulders. She stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. People around her thought she was nervous, which was normal for a bride. They smiled and told her she looked beautiful. She nodded, but her smile felt forced. Her breathing was shallow. Each breath felt like effort. She told herself to calm down, that this was what everyone expected. This was what had been planned for months. Her heart, however, felt heavy, not excited. She closed her eyes for a moment, hoping the feeling would pass. On the other side of the church, the groom stood waiting. He adjusted his jacket and smiled when friends teased him. He felt nervous too, but his nervousness came with happiness. He believed this day would change his life for the better. He trusted the future waiting for him at the altar. When the music began, the guests stood. The doors slowly opened, and the bride stepped forward. The room fell quiet in the way it always does during such moments. She walked carefully, each step measured. People admired her dress, her grace, her calm appearance. From a distance, everything looked perfect. The preacher watched her approach. At first, he saw nothing unusual. But as she came closer, something caught his attention. It was not her dress or her posture. It was her face. Her eyes were wide, but not with joy. They looked distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely. He noticed her lips tremble slightly, then tighten again. He told himself not to judge too quickly. Weddings were emotional events. Many brides felt overwhelmed. Still, he could not ignore the feeling growing in his chest. He had learned over the years to pay attention to small signs, the ones people often missed. The ceremony began. The preacher spoke calmly, his voice steady. The bride and groom stood facing each other. The groom smiled softly at her, trying to reassure her. She looked back at him briefly, then lowered her eyes again as the preacher continued. The bride's hands began to shake. She tried to hide it by gripping them tighter. The preacher noticed. So did the groom, but he assumed it was just nerves. He whispered quietly, asking if she was okay. She nodded without looking up. The words of the ceremony filled the church, but something felt off. The bride's breathing grew faster. Her chest rose and fell more quickly now. Sweat formed along her forehead. Despite the cool air inside the church, the preacher paused for a brief moment, then continued. He reached the part of the ceremony that asked for commitment, spoken clearly and freely. As he asked the question, the bride did not answer. Seconds passed. The silence felt longer than it was. Guests shifted in their seats. Someone coughed nervously. The groom leaned closer, whispering her name. Concern now clear in his voice. The bride's lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes filled with tears. She swallowed hard, trying to speak, but her body seemed frozen. The preacher felt his heart drop. This was no longer normal nervousness. This was fear. He raised his hand gently, signaling a pause. His voice remained calm but firm. He asked for a moment to stop the ceremony. Murmurs spread through the church like a quiet wave. No one understood what was happening, but everyone felt the tension. The bride's legs began to shake. She struggled to stay standing. The groom reached out to support her, his face filled with confusion and worry. He asked again if she was okay. This time, she shook her head slowly. The preacher stepped closer. He spoke softly, asking if she felt safe continuing. She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his decision clear. It was not doubt. It was not hesitation. It was distress. He asked for the couple to step aside for a moment. The guests watched in disbelief as the ceremony came to a full stop. Some thought it was a misunderstanding. Others felt uncomfortable, sensing that something serious was unfolding. As the bride was guided away from the altar, whispers grew louder. Questions filled the air. The groom stood frozen, unsure whether to follow or stay. His heart raced, fear replacing excitement. Inside a quiet room away from the crowd, the bride finally broke down. Tears flowed freely now. She struggled to breathe as the weight she had been carrying began to surface. The preacher sat across from her, listening carefully, not interrupting, not rushing. Outside, the guests waited, confused and restless. The groom stared at the closed door, his thoughts spinning. He could not imagine what could stop a wedding at this point. He hoped it was a simple issue, something that could be fixed quickly. But deep inside, a truth was already forming. Something had gone terribly wrong, and this wedding might never return to what it was meant to be. And that was only the beginning. The room behind the altar was quiet, but it did not feel peaceful. The walls seemed closer than before, and the air felt heavy. The bride sat on a small chair, her hands covering her face as her shoulders shook. She was no longer trying to hold herself together. Everything she had been holding inside for months was breaking free. The preacher did not rush her. He sat a short distance away, giving her space. He had seen moments of fear before, but this felt different. This was not a sudden panic. This was something that had been growing for a long time. Outside the room, the groom stood with his back against the wall. His hands were clenched into fists. His mind kept replaying the moment the ceremony stopped. He had never imagined this could happen. He felt exposed, as if the entire church was staring at his failure. Even though he did not yet understand what that failure was, guests whispered among themselves. Some were worried. Others were impatient. A few were already forming opinions without knowing the truth. Weddings were supposed to be happy, simple events. This one had turned into something uncomfortable, something people did not know how to react to. Inside the room, the bride slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She tried to wipe her tears, embarrassed by her loss of control. The preacher spoke softly, telling her she was not in trouble, that she could take her time. His calm voice helped her breathe more evenly. After several moments, she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet and uneven. She said she did not know where to begin. The words felt heavy in her mouth, like stones. She had never said them out loud before. She explained that the wedding had not started with happiness for her. From the beginning, she had felt trapped by expectations. Her family had believed this marriage was the right choice. They had talked about stability, respect, and reputation. They had reminded her of her age, her responsibilities, and the fear of being alone. Slowly, her own feelings had been pushed aside. She said that when she tried to express doubt, she was told that fear was normal. When she hesitated, she was told she would regret saying no. Over time, she stopped speaking. She learned to nod, to agree, to pretend. Everyone assumed her silence meant consent. The preacher listened carefully. He did not interrupt. Every word confirmed what he had sensed at the altar. This was not a woman choosing freely. This was a woman being carried by pressure into a life she was not ready for. Meanwhile, the groom was finally invited into the room. He entered cautiously, unsure of what he would hear. When he saw her sitting there, Broken and exhausted, his anger faded. Confusion took its place. He asked what was wrong, his voice softer than before. She looked at him, tears filling her eyes again. She said she never meant to hurt him. She said she had tried to convince herself that love would come later. She believed that if she followed the plan, everything would work out. The groom felt as if the floor had shifted beneath him. He had believed this marriage was built on shared choice. Hearing her words made him question every moment they had spent together. He wondered how much of her smiles had been real and how much had been forced. The preacher spoke again, gently but clearly. He said marriage was not only about ceremony and promises spoken aloud, it was about truth, safety, and willingness. Without those, words meant nothing. Outside, time passed slowly. Guests checked their phones, whispered guesses, and grew restless. Some were angry, blaming the delay on drama. Others felt uneasy, sensing that something serious was happening behind the closed door. The bride admitted that standing at the altar had overwhelmed her. When the question was asked, her body reacted before her mind could respond. Fear took control. She could not lie anymore. The silence that followed felt terrifying, but also relieving. The groom struggled to process everything. He asked if there was something he could have done differently. She shook her head. She said the pressure did not come from him directly, but from everything surrounding the wedding. The expectations, the plans, the fear of disappointing others. The preacher knew what needed to be done. But he also knew it would not be easy. Stopping a wedding was never simple. It came with judgment, anger, and long-lasting consequences. Still, allowing it to continue would cause even greater harm. He stepped outside to address the guests. The room quieted as soon as people saw his expression. His face showed seriousness, not confusion. That alone made people uneasy. He explained calmly that the ceremony could not continue at this time. He did not share private details, but he made it clear that the decision was about well-being and honesty. He asked for patience and respect. The reaction was mixed. Some guests nodded quietly, understanding more than they said. Others looked shocked and offended. A few whispered harsh words, blaming the bride without knowing her story. The groom stood behind the preacher, silent. He felt exposed and vulnerable, but he also felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, he saw the situation not as a failure, but as a warning. Inside the room, the bride listened as the noise outside grew louder. She felt guilt, fear, and relief, all at once. She knew her life would not return to what it was before today, but she also knew she could not have continued living a lie. The preacher returned and told her that no matter what happened next, she had done the right thing by speaking up. He reminded her that courage often looked like chaos at first, as guests slowly began to leave. The church felt emptier than before. Decorations that once symbolized joy now felt heavy and out of place. The silence after everyone left was deeper than the silence before the ceremony. The groom stayed behind. He sat alone on one of the wooden benches, staring at the floor. He realized that love could not be built on silence. He did not yet know what his future would look like, but he knew this moment had changed him. The bride stepped outside later, breathing fresh air for the first time that day. The sky looked the same as before, but everything felt different. The weight on her chest had not disappeared, but it had shifted. She was scared, but she was also free from pretending. The preacher watched her walk away, knowing that this story was far from over. The wedding had stopped, but the consequences were just beginning, and the truth that came out that day would soon reach far beyond the church walls. The news spread faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, nearly everyone in town had heard that the wedding had stopped at the altar. People talked about it in shops, on sidewalks, and over phone calls. Each person added their own version, their own guesses, their own judgment. Some stories were gentle, others were harsh. Very few were accurate. The bride stayed inside her home that day. She did not answer calls or messages. The silence felt safer than facing the world. Her family moved quietly around her, unsure what to say. Some were worried about her health. Others were worried about what people would say. The difference mattered more than anyone admitted. She lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. The raised hand, the silence, the eyes watching her. At times, shame washed over her. At other times, relief did. The emotions came in waves, leaving her exhausted. The groom, meanwhile, returned to his empty apartment. The suit he had worn lay folded on a chair, untouched since the ceremony stopped. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at it. He had dreamed of that day for so long. Now it felt like a memory that did not belong to him. He tried to make sense of everything. He thought about their conversations, their plans, their quiet moments together. Had he missed something important? Had he been too focused on the future to notice the present? These questions had no easy answers. At the church, the preacher arrived early the next day. He unlocked the doors and walked inside alone. The decorations were still there, flowers slowly wilting, ribbons hanging loosely. The place felt heavy, like it was holding on to the events of the previous day. He sat on one of the benches and closed his eyes. He knew his decision would be questioned. Some would say he overstepped. Others would say he embarrassed everyone. But deep down, he felt calm. He had followed his conscience. Later that afternoon, the bride's family gathered in the living room. The mood was tense. No one raised their voice, but every word felt sharp. Some relatives believed the wedding could have been paused quietly without public attention. Others believed it should have never been arranged in the first place. The bride listened quietly. She did not interrupt. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tired. She said she could not go through with a marriage built on fear. She said she had tried to be strong, but strength did not mean silence. The room fell quiet. Some faces softened. Others remained cold. The reality was difficult to accept. A stopped wedding was not just a personal issue. It affected families, reputations, and long-held beliefs. The groom's family reacted differently. Some felt anger toward the preacher. Others felt confusion toward the bride. A few tried to understand both sides, but emotions made logic difficult. That evening, the groom went for a long walk. He needed space to think without voices around him. The streets were familiar, but everything felt different. He wondered if love could survive something like this, or if it had never truly existed. As he walked, he remembered small moments, shared laughter, quiet dinners, long talks about the future. Were those moments real? Or were they shaped by expectation rather than choice? The thought hurt more than anger ever could. Days passed and the story did not fade. If anything, it grew. Some people treated the bride with kindness, offering support quietly. Others avoided her completely. A few spoke openly, blaming her for everything that had happened. She felt the weight of those looks when she finally stepped outside. At the market, conversations stopped when she walked by. At times, she wanted to disappear, but she reminded herself that going back into silence would only bring her back to where she started. The preacher reached out to her, checking on her well-being. He reminded her that healing took time. He also reminded her that courage often came with consequences. His words did not erase the pain, but they gave her something solid to hold on to. The groom also received a message from the preacher. They met quietly at the church one evening. The groom asked hard questions. Why was the wedding stopped publicly? Could it have been handled differently? The preacher answered honestly. He said moments of fear required immediate care, not delay. The groom listened carefully. He did not fully agree, but he understood the reasoning. For the first time, he saw the situation not as humiliation, but as protection. The two spoke for a long time, about expectations, about communication, about how easily silence could be mistaken for agreement. When they parted, neither felt peace yet, but both felt a step closer to truth. The bride and groom did not speak during this time. The distance felt necessary. Too many emotions were still raw. Still, both thought about each other often, wondering if there was a path forward or if that path had already closed. One afternoon, the bride sat alone near her window, watching people pass by. She realized that her life had changed in a way she could not undo. But she also realized something else. For the first time in a long while, her future felt uncertain in a way that belonged to her. She began to write. Not letters, not messages, but thoughts. She wrote about fear, pressure, and silence. She wrote about how easy it was to lose oneself while trying to please others. The words did not solve anything, but they helped her breathe. The groom, on his side, started to notice things about himself. He saw how often he assumed things were fine without asking deeper questions. He realized that love required more listening than planning. The town slowly adjusted. New stories replaced old ones, though whispers remained. Life moved on, but the memory of that day stayed. It had left a mark on everyone involved. The preacher continued his work, though with a deeper awareness. He spoke more openly about consent, choice, and honesty during ceremonies. Some appreciated it. Others felt uncomfortable. But the conversations had begun. As weeks passed, the bride felt stronger, though not healed. The groom felt wiser, though not settled. Both stood at a crossroads they never expected. And while the wedding had ended, the story between them was not yet finished. The decision made at the altar had only opened the door. Two truths that still needed to be faced. The distance between them lasted longer than either expected. Days turned into weeks, and the silence grew heavier with time. People assumed that no communication meant the end of everything, but the truth was more complicated. Both were thinking, reflecting, trying to understand themselves before facing each other again. The bride slowly returned to her routine. She began leaving the house more often, even when it felt uncomfortable. At first, every step outside felt like walking into judgment. She could feel eyes on her, hear whispers that stopped when she passed. Still, she kept going. Staying hidden had once been her way of surviving, and she did not want to live that way anymore. She found comfort in small things. Morning walks, quiet moments with a cup of tea, writing thoughts she never planned to share. Each simple habit helped her rebuild a sense of control. She reminded herself daily that stopping the wedding did not mean she had failed. It meant she had finally listened to herself. Her family struggled in different ways. Some relatives avoided the topic entirely. Others brought it up often, sometimes gently, sometimes with frustration. They worried about what the future would look like for her now. In their minds, marriage had been the solution to many fears. Without it, everything felt uncertain. She tried to explain that uncertainty was not always bad. She said fear should not decide a life. Some understood. Others did not. Change came slowly, but at least the conversations had begun. The groom, on the other hand, threw himself into work. Long hours helped him avoid quiet moments when his thoughts became too loud. He told himself he was fine, but nights were difficult. The apartment felt empty in a way it never had before. He began to realize how much of his identity had been tied to the idea of marriage. The plans, the expectations, the role he believed he was meant to play. Without those, he felt unsure of who he was becoming. One evening, he visited the church alone. It was open, but empty. He sat on the same bench where he had waited after the ceremony stopped. The memory still felt sharp. He did not blame anyone in that moment. He simply felt loss. The preacher noticed him and joined him quietly. They spoke again, this time less formally. The groom admitted that he felt confused, not angry. He said he wanted to understand what went wrong, not just move past it. The preacher listened and said something simple. He said that sometimes love existed, but timing and readiness did not. He said, understanding that truth could hurt more than rejection. But it was still important. Those words stayed with the groom. Meanwhile, the bride received a message she had been both expecting and fearing. It was from the groom. The message was short and respectful. He asked if they could talk, not to argue or decide anything, but to understand. She stared at the screen for a long time before responding. Her hands shook, but she knew avoiding the conversation would only keep them both stuck. She agreed to meet in a quiet place where they could speak freely. When they finally sat across from each other, neither knew where to begin. They looked different somehow. Not in appearance, but in presence. The distance had changed them. The groom spoke first. He said he was not there to blame her. He said he wanted honesty. even if it hurt. He asked if there had ever been a moment when she truly wanted the marriage. She took a deep breath before answering. She said there were moments when she hoped it would work, moments when she believed love might grow with time. But she admitted she never felt fully free to choose. That freedom mattered more than she had realized. The groom listened carefully. The truth was painful, but it was also clear. He admitted that he had assumed silence meant agreement. He said he wished he had asked harder questions sooner. They spoke for a long time. About fear. About expectations. About how easy it was to confuse comfort with commitment. Tears were shed, but no voices were raised. The conversation was heavy, but it felt necessary. By the end, neither promised anything. They did not decide to reunite or separate forever. What they did decide was to respect each other's honesty. That alone felt like progress. Word of their meeting spread as things often did in small communities. Some people hoped it meant the wedding would be back on. Others criticized them for reopening old wounds. Neither listened too closely. The bride felt lighter after the conversation, even though nothing was resolved. Speaking the truth out loud made it real, and reality felt better than pretending. The groom felt something shift as well. He realized that love was not about convincing someone to stay. It was about allowing them to choose freely, even if that choice led away. The preacher noticed changes too. He saw the bride walk with more confidence. He saw the groom speak with more thoughtfulness. He knew healing was happening, even if slowly. As time passed, the community began to settle. The story was no longer new. Life continued, but something had changed beneath the surface. People talked more openly about choice and pressure. Parents listened more carefully. Young couples asked deeper questions. The bride started helping at a local center, supporting others who felt trapped by expectations. She did not tell her story openly, but she listened with understanding. Helping others helped her heal herself. The groom volunteered more as well, finding purpose outside of plans that no longer existed. He learned to sit with uncertainty instead of rushing to fix it. They crossed paths occasionally. Sometimes they spoke. Sometimes they simply nodded. There was no bitterness. It's only a quiet understanding of what they had shared and what they had learned. One evening, the bride stood outside the church watching the doors close after a service. She thought about the day everything changed. She no longer felt shame. She felt gratitude for the moment that stopped her from moving forward in fear. The groom, elsewhere, looked at the sky and felt something similar. He did not know what his future held, but he knew it would be built on clearer ground. The preacher locked the church doors and paused, reflecting on how one decision had affected so many lives. He believed that sometimes the most loving act was interruption. The wedding never continued. But growth did, and with that growth came choices that would shape what happened next. Time did not heal everything, but it changed how the pain felt. What once felt sharp slowly became dull, like a scar that still ached, but no longer bled. Both the bride and the groom continued moving forward, each in their own way, carrying lessons they never expected to learn. The bride's days began to feel fuller. Not happier all the time, but steadier. She kept helping at the local center, listening to people who came in with heavy hearts and confused thoughts. Many of them did not even realize they were living under pressure. They spoke about family expectations, fear of loneliness, and the weight of tradition. She never judged them. She simply listened. Often, that was enough. Sometimes, after those long conversations, she would walk home feeling exhausted but peaceful. She realized that her story, though painful, had given her something valuable. It had taught her how to recognize quiet suffering in others. It had given her a voice she never knew she had. Her family slowly adjusted as well. The tension in the house eased. There were fewer sharp remarks and more careful words. Some relatives still believed things could have been handled differently, but they no longer pushed her to fix what they thought was broken. Over time, they saw that she was not falling apart. In fact, she was becoming stronger. The groom's journey was quieter, more internal. He continued working hard, but he no longer used work as a shield. He started paying attention to his thoughts, instead of running from them. He spent time alone, learning to sit with discomfort instead of filling every moment with noise. He began writing too, though not as openly. He wrote about expectations placed on him as well, about how he had been taught that success meant settling down by a certain age, about how he had mistaken readiness for certainty. Seeing those thoughts on paper made him realize how little space he had given himself to question anything. One evening, he ran into the preacher again. They talked briefly, nothing heavy. But before parting, the groom thanked him. The words surprised even him. He said that stopping the wedding had forced him to grow in ways he might have avoided otherwise. The preacher nodded. Understanding the weight behind that simple statement, the community continued to shift, almost without noticing. Stories of the stopped wedding still surfaced now and then, but they carried less judgment and more reflection. Parents spoke differently to their children. Couples talked longer before making commitments. It was subtle, but real. The bride and groom crossed paths more often as time passed. Not intentionally, but naturally. Sometimes at the market, sometimes near the church. Their conversations were polite, sometimes warm, sometimes distant. Neither pushed for more than the moment allowed. One afternoon, they sat together on a bench outside a quiet cafe. The meeting was unplanned, but it felt comfortable. They talked about simple things: work, weather, small changes in town. There was no tension, only a shared understanding of what they had survived. At one point, the groom admitted that he no longer felt angry about what happened. He said he still felt sad sometimes, but sadness felt honest. The bride nodded. She said sadness was easier to carry than fear. They both agreed on one thing. If the wedding had continued, it would have broken them slowly. Stopping it had hurt all at once. But it had also saved them from a deeper pain. As the seasons changed, so did their sense of identity. The bride no longer saw herself as the woman whose wedding was stopped. She saw herself as someone who chose honesty when it mattered most. The groom no longer saw himself as someone who lost a future. He saw himself as someone who gained clarity. The preacher watched these changes quietly. He did not involve himself unless needed. He believed growth worked best when given space. Still, he felt grateful when he saw them standing stronger, even if separately. One evening, during a small gathering at the church, the preacher spoke about choice and courage. He did not mention the wedding directly, but everyone understood. He said that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was say no when everyone expected a yes. The room was silent, thoughtful. The bride listened from the back, feeling a mix of pride and humility. She had never wanted to be an example. She had only wanted to survive. Yet here she was, unknowingly helping others find their voice. The groom listened too, standing near the door. He felt no resentment, only respect. He understood now that love was not proven by endurance alone, but by freedom. Later that night, the bride returned home and sat by her window. She thought about the future. It still felt uncertain, but it no longer frightened her. She trusted herself now. The groom, elsewhere, felt something similar. He no longer rushed to define his future. He believed that clarity would come in time, and when it did, it would feel right. The wedding never resumed. The decorations were gone. The plans were memories. But what remained was something stronger than tradition. It was understanding, and as both continued forward, they carried a quiet truth with them. Sometimes, the most important thing a person can do is stop. Even when the world expects them to continue, life did not suddenly become easy for either of them, but it became more honest. That honesty changed how they faced each day. They were no longer pretending for anyone, and that alone felt like progress. The bride began to notice small changes in herself. She spoke more confidently, even in simple situations. When someone asked her opinion, she gave it without apologizing first. When she disagreed, she no longer felt guilty. These were small shifts, but they meant everything to her. At the center where she volunteered, people started trusting her deeply. Some shared stories they had never told anyone before. They spoke about staying silent to keep peace, about choosing paths others expected them to take. She listened with care, never pushing, never judging. She knew how fragile truth could feel when spoken for the first time, One evening, a young woman thanked her quietly before leaving. She said the conversation had helped her rethink a decision she was afraid to question. The bride walked home that night feeling emotional. She realized that pain, when understood, could turn into purpose. The groom also experienced changes, though he noticed them more slowly. He found himself questioning things he once accepted without thought. At work, he spoke up when something felt wrong. With friends, he listened more carefully instead of rushing to give advice. He stopped avoiding quiet moments. Instead, he allowed himself to sit with his thoughts even when they were uncomfortable. He learned that discomfort did not mean failure. Sometimes it meant growth. The two continued crossing paths from time to time. Their conversations remained calm and respectful. There was no pressure to define what they were to each other. They allowed the connection to exist without forcing it into a shape. One afternoon, they found themselves walking together after leaving the market. The conversation flowed naturally. They spoke about everyday things, then slowly moved toward deeper thoughts. The groom admitted that he had started to understand how pressure affected people differently. He said he used to think strength meant pushing through everything. Now he believed strength sometimes meant stopping. The bride smiled softly. She said she used to think love meant sacrifice no matter the cost. Now she believed love should not require losing oneself. They walked in silence for a while after that. Both reflecting, the preacher observed these moments from a distance. He did not interfere. He believed healing did not need guidance once truth had been spoken. Still, he felt grateful that his decision had led to understanding rather than lasting bitterness. At the church, he began offering more private counseling sessions. People came with questions they had never dared to ask before. Some were young couples, others were parents. Many wanted reassurance that choice and faith could exist together. The town slowly embraced these conversations. Not everyone agreed, but disagreement no longer felt dangerous. People were learning to listen. The bride's family continued adjusting as well. Some relatives admitted they had not realized how much pressure they had placed on her. Others remained quiet, unsure how to face their role in what had happened. Still, there was less tension, more patience. One night, the bride sat with an older family member who had once pushed strongly for the marriage. They spoke honestly for the first time. The older relative admitted fear had guided many of their decisions. Fear of judgment. Fear of change. Hearing this helped the bride understand that pressure often came from unhealed places. The groom had a similar moment with someone close to him. They spoke about expectations placed on men, about responsibility and timing. The conversation felt freeing. It allowed him to see that he, too, had been living according to a script he never questioned. As weeks passed, both noticed something unexpected. They no longer felt defined by the stopped wedding. It had become a part of their story, not the center of it. The bride started thinking about future plans again, but this time without urgency. She explored interests she once ignored. She considered paths she never thought were allowed. The future felt open instead of demanding. The groom felt something similar. He stopped measuring his life against timelines others followed. He trusted that meaning did not depend on speed. One evening, they met again near the church after a community event. The air was calm, the sky dim with early evening light. They spoke about how much had changed since that day. Neither felt anger. Neither felt regret. The groom said something that surprised them both. He said that even though the wedding never continued, he did not see it as a loss anymore. He saw it as a turning point that saved them from living lives that did not belong to them. The bride agreed. She said she used to fear that moment would define her forever. Now she believed it had freed her. They parted with a quiet understanding. No promises. No expectations. Just respect. The preacher watched them leave in opposite directions and felt a deep sense of peace. He knew the hardest part was not stopping the wedding. It was helping people see that stopping was not the end. The town settled into its routines again. New events replaced old memories, but something had shifted beneath the surface. People were thinking more deeply. Speaking more honestly, the wedding never continued. But life did, and both the bride and the groom were learning that moving forward did not require forgetting the past. It required understanding it. The story was approaching a new chapter. one shaped not by tradition or pressure, but by choice. Months passed. The memory of the stopped wedding no longer felt heavy. It became a quiet reminder rather than a wound. The town moved on, but the lesson stayed. The bride felt stronger than ever before. She trusted her voice now. Decisions no longer scared her the way they once had. She understood that saying no did not make her weak. It made her honest. People noticed the change in her. Some admired it. Others were challenged by it. She accepted both. The groom also changed in ways that surprised him. He no longer rushed toward the future. He listened more, spoke less, and thought deeply before acting. He realized that love was not about holding on, but about allowing space. They met one last time, not planned, but natural. There was no tension, only respect. They spoke briefly, sharing a quiet smile. Both knew they were walking different paths now. That was okay. The preacher continued his work, carrying the lesson with him. He believed that sometimes faith meant stopping, not proceeding. Protecting one person's truth was worth more than pleasing a crowd. What began as shock had become understanding. What looked like an ending had become a beginning. The wedding never continued, but courage did, and in that courage, everyone involved found something they had been missing all along. Time passed and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. What once felt like a moment that broke everything became a moment that shaped everything instead. The bride no longer carried shame when she thought about that day. She carried understanding. She knew now that listening to herself had saved her from a life built on fear. She continued helping others. Not because she had all the answers, but because she knew how it felt to be unheard. Her quiet strength became something people noticed. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that lasted. She learned that peace did not come from meeting expectations, but from choosing honesty. The groom found his own sense of peace as well. He stopped measuring his life by deadlines set by others. He built his days around purpose, not pressure. The pain of the past did not disappear, but it no longer controlled him. He understood that love should never require silence from the person.
Standing beside you.
He never regretted stopping the wedding. Over time, people came to respect that decision, even those who once criticized it. His choice reminded many that protecting truth mattered more than completing a ceremony. The town changed in quiet ways. Parents listened more closely. Couples spoke more openly. Silence was no longer mistaken for agreement. One moment of courage had created space for many. Honest conversations. The bride and groom never returned to what they once planned, and that was okay. Their paths moved forward separately, guided by clarity rather than expectation. There was no bitterness, only acceptance. The wedding never continued. But something more important did. Understanding growth, choice, and in the end, everyone learned that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop before continuing costs them who they truly are.